A farmer risked his tractor to save a bus full of kids from a flood. 1 week later, the National Guard shows up with a medal ceremony. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. No one in the small town of Riverside expected a flood to transform their peaceful valley into a raging torrent, least of all Henry McAllister, a farmer who had spent all his 62 years working the land. The season had been unusually wet, but no warning sounded urgent enough to cause alarm. The morning sky had been steel gray, promising more storms to come. Yet people continued on with their daily routines. Henry lived alone on a modest tract of farmland at the edge of the river, a patch of fertile ground where he grew corn and kept a handful of livestock. His pride and joy, apart from that land, was a battered old tractor that had once belonged to his father. With chipped paint and a seat mended repeatedly by Henry's own hands, the tractor was his lifeline during planting and harvesting seasons. It also served as a reminder of the hard-working generations who came before him. On the day of the flood, Henry rose early as usual, intending to check the irrigation ditches and feed his animals. Overnight rains had swelled the waterways, but he had no clue just how much water was rushing downstream. With a thermos of coffee and his old dog Bear at his side, he headed out onto the wet fields, mud sucking at his boots. The roar of the river sounded louder than usual, but Henry assumed it was just another high-water event. Meanwhile, a school bus transporting a group of elementary students made its usual route through the winding roads of Riverside. The children, excited to see the farmland and rolling hills, chattered away as the driver, Mr. Saunders, navigated the slick pavement. A gentle, soft-spoken man, Saunders had driven that bus route for years without incident. He might have noticed the rising water at the next crossroads, if the storm's sudden deluge hadn't obscured his visibility. Riverside's farmland was crisscrossed by a network of small bridges and culverts. Most of the time, these were little more than trickling streams. However, on rare occasions, they could become dangerous channels. That morning, the river had burst its usual banks, funneling water through every possible outlet. Fields were turning into shallow lakes, and ditches were becoming raging currents, all while the local radio station only hinted at the severity of the threat. Henry heard a faint cry carried by the wind, though at first he thought it was just the call of a distant neighbor. Bear raised his ears, letting out a soft whine. The farmer peered across a newly formed channel of swirling brown water, cutting right through his cornfield. Then, to his astonishment, he spotted a big yellow shape in the distance, a school bus partially submerged, front wheels sinking into what used to be a small creek. The water was surging so powerfully that the bus was rocking from side to side, threatening to tip. Henry felt a jolt of alarm shoot through him. He didn't know how many passengers were inside, but if it was a regular school day, there could be dozens of kids in jeopardy. Without pausing to think about his own safety, he ran for his tractor. The well-worn tires weren't ideal for crossing floodwaters, but it had enough weight and power to handle muddy ground better than any pickup truck. Clambering onto the seat, he started the engine. Bear barked urgently, as if urging Henry to hurry. The drive toward the stranded bus felt surreal. Sheets of rain pelted Henry's face, and water churned over the farmland that used to be his carefully managed rows of crops. He saw that the bus was perched precariously on a crumbling embankment, with water flowing around it like a torrent. Inside, silhouettes of children pressed against the windows, their faces pale with fear. Mr. Saunders stood by the doors, frantically waving his arms, but it was clear he was unsure if he should evacuate the kids or wait for rescue. Henry pulled the tractor up onto higher ground, close enough to assess the danger. One wrong move, and the bus might be swept into deeper waters. He hopped off and yelled through the wind, "Saunders, you all right?" The bus driver, drenched and trembling, shouted back, "We've got kids in here, Henry. I can't get them out. The current is too strong." Without hesitation, Henry declared, "We'll do this slow and steady. Tie the bus to my tractor." He rummaged in the tractor's toolbox for heavy towing chains. With the roaring flood lapping at his ankles, Henry waded to the bus. Fearful children peered from the windows, tears welling in some eyes, while others tried to stay brave. Mr. Saunders helped Henry loop the chain around the bus's front axle. Water pressure tugged at Henry's body, as though invisible hands tried to drag him downstream. He fought to keep his footing, hooking the chain securely, then slogged back to the tractor and attached the other end. Henry knew the risk he was taking. If the chain snapped, or if the bus's front wheels slipped further, his beloved tractor and all those children could be lost in the raging current. But there was no time for doubt. He climbed back onto the tractor, his heart pounding. One by one, he tested the gears, pressing the accelerator gently, feeling the machine's tires dig into the muddy ground. The engine groaned, but the tractor did not budge. For a moment, Henry feared he couldn't gain enough traction. He refused to panic. Throttle up. The old engine bellowed. Black smoke puffed from the exhaust. Slowly, the tractor lurched forward. The chain went taut, water splashing in every direction. Inside the bus, the children braced themselves, eyes wide, as the bus inched backward from the embankment. Henry's arms strained against the steering wheel, knuckles white, determination etched on his face. If he let off the power too quickly, the bus might slide. If he overdid it, the tractor might lose its footing. Progress was agonizingly slow, but inch by inch, the bus inched back onto more solid ground. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the front tires emerged from the torrent. Mr. Saunders opened the doors, guiding the frightened kids onto higher ground. They stumbled through the muddy field, grateful tears mixing with rainwater. Henry let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He'd done it. The tractor had saved them all, but the victory was short-lived. As soon as the last child stepped off, part of the embankment under the tractor's rear wheels gave way. Henry's eyes widened in alarm. The tractor lurched sideways, mud sliding out from under it. He attempted to steer away, but the weight of the machine had compromised the weakened ground. Before he could jump clear, the tractor's back tire plunged into the swirling flood. In a flash, Henry was pitched forward. Bear barked frantically from the sidelines. The bus driver lunged to help, but was too far away. A wave of muddy water crashed over the tractor, nearly toppling it. With every ounce of strength, Henry clung to the steering wheel, trying to keep from being thrown. He felt the machine quiver. For a moment, he thought it was all over. Then, with one desperate surge, the tractor's front wheels caught a patch of firmer ground. Henry jammed the gear into reverse, the tires spinning, flinging mud, but at last they found enough grip to pull the tractor upright. Shaken but uninjured, Henry climbed off, water streaming from his soaked clothes. Bear bounded over, whining and licking at Henry's boots. The children and Mr. Saunders cheered, relief overwhelming them. The bus was safe, and so was Henry, though the tractor would bear fresh scars from that day. Exhausted, Henry waved aside any fuss. "Just doing what anyone would," he mumbled, though everyone knew that wasn't quite true. He had risked everything, his prized tractor and his own life, to save those kids. In the aftermath, emergency crews converged on the scene. The sheriff arrived, shaking his head in disbelief at the improvised rescue. News spread fast through Riverside, a community that rarely saw such drama. Reporters from nearby towns showed up to snap pictures of the old tractor, half caked in mud, battered but standing. Henry found himself in the center of attention, which he disliked. His sole comfort was that no one had been lost to the flood that day. Within hours, the floodwaters began to recede, leaving behind a soggy mess of debris. Broken fences, uprooted crops, and battered roads told the story of nature's fury. But the near tragedy of the bus rescue stole every headline. Over and over, neighbors repeated how Henry, that quiet man with the old tractor, had come to the children's rescue when no one else could. The local radio anchor called him a hero, a title that made him squirm. "I'm just a farmer who did what needed to be done," he insisted over and over. Life slowly returned to a version of normal in Riverside. The school bus was towed away for repairs. Families expressed their gratitude to Henry, bringing him hot meals and gifts of appreciation, though he tried to wave them off. Days passed, the waters receded, and Henry quietly went about cleaning up his property. Each night he collapsed into bed, sore muscles reminding him of that day's ordeal. He thought that, with time, the fuss would fade. But a week later, bright shapes appeared on Henry's driveway. Military vehicles from the National Guard. Henry, baffled, set down his shovel and stepped outside to greet them. Men and women in uniform disembarked with formal expressions. Behind them, the sheriff arrived, along with Mr. Saunders and a handful of the children from the bus. Henry's heart pounded. He had no idea what was about to happen, but from the looks on their faces it was something serious. As he approached, the ranking officer stepped forward, a shining medal in hand. "Mr. McAllister," she began, her voice echoing through the still morning air, "on behalf of the state and the National Guard, we wish to commend you for your extraordinary bravery." Henry felt his cheeks burn. He wasn't used to such praise, and as she pinned the medal to his worn jacket, tears he couldn't hold back welled in his eyes. The entire gathering erupted in applause. Henry could hardly believe the fuss that descended on his small farm after the National Guard's formal visit. The medal they pinned to his faded work jacket felt as heavy as a bucket of stones, and he still wasn't comfortable with all the attention. Neighbors kept dropping by to congratulate him, sometimes bringing homemade pies or casseroles. Strangers appeared at his gate, eager to shake his hand or ask him for an interview. He did his best to be polite, but every conversation reminded him of that day when his tractor nearly plunged into the raging water. No matter how many times he insisted he was only doing what anyone would have done, people treated him like a bona fide hero. Amid all this, the children from the bus were trying to bounce back. Some families had kept them at home for a few days to recover from the shock of the near disaster. Gradually, though, they returned to school. Their parents would spot Henry at the local grocery or feed store, and they'd walk over to say thank you again. A few offered money for repairs to the tractor, but Henry waved them off. He was proud and stubborn, not quite sure how to handle generosity that seemed outsized for what he viewed as a simple act of neighborly care. Yet the memory of the bus rocking on the floodwaters and those small faces pressed against the windows stayed in his mind as a stark reminder of how quickly life could shift from ordinary to perilous. Over the next week, the hustle in town died down, replaced by the realities of flood damage. Riverside, with its patchwork of farmland, had been battered worse than anyone realized. Fences were torn out, roads buckled, and entire rows of crops were lost to standing water. Concerned about the cost of rebuilding, the farmers held urgent meetings. Some had insurance that might cover part of the damage, but many were facing a grim season ahead. Henry understood that sense of uncertainty. With much of his own corn ruined, he'd have to rely on savings to get through the year. He was mucking out his barn one afternoon when he heard a vehicle crunching over the gravel drive. A tall figure stepped out, wearing a jacket with the insignia of a local news station. Henry recognized her as Linda Carr, the reporter who had first broken the story of the bus rescue. She seemed friendly enough, but Henry had steered clear of the media after the initial coverage. He wiped sweat from his brow and set aside the pitchfork, trying to summon up courtesy despite his reluctance. Linda approached with a notepad in hand, her camera operator following close behind. "Mr. McAllister," she said, offering a handshake, "I'm sorry to bother you, but we're doing a follow-up about the flood's impact. I know you've had a lot on your plate, especially after what happened with the bus. Would you mind telling us how you're faring now?" Henry grimaced slightly. He wanted to be left to his chores, but Linda's polite tone softened him. "We're managing," he replied. "My fields took a beating, though. Probably lost half my corn. Still, could have been worse." Linda nodded sympathetically. "Would you say the community is coming together? Any assistance from the county or state?" Henry shrugged. "Folks here help each other. The guard dropping by with that ceremony was plenty surprising. There's talk about a relief fund, but I'm not holding my breath. The reporter's questions continued. Henry answered briefly, not wanting to open up too much about the damage. He figured there were farmers worse off than him. Still, Linda pressed gently. How about your tractor? We heard it nearly went under. Henry patted the old machine parked in the shade. It's a tough piece of equipment. Got some dents and a lot of rust I didn't have before, but she still runs. Finally, Linda wrapped up. She thanked Henry, promising to highlight the struggles local farmers faced. Once they were gone, he felt a twinge of regret at not sounding more grateful. The news coverage might help the region get some attention, or even resources. But stoicism was in Henry's nature, so he returned to his tasks, hoping that the next planting season would be kinder. The following day, Henry traveled into town to buy supplies. Main Street was busier than usual, with trucks delivering construction materials for road repairs. He parked his pickup and wove through the bustle, tipping his cap to townsfolk he recognized. Outside the feed store, a small crowd had gathered around two uniformed men handing out pamphlets. One introduced himself as Lieutenant Colton from the National Guard. He recognized Henry immediately, offering a respectful nod. "Mr. McAllister," the lieutenant said, stepping forward. "Good to see you again. This might sound sudden, but we'd like your input on a new safety plan for the county. Your rescue of that bus highlighted the need for earlier flood warnings, better equipment, and volunteers who can respond quickly." Henry blinked. "Me? I'm no expert, Lieutenant. That day was just... We understand. But your quick actions saved lives. And you know this land better than most. We're asking a few local leaders, plus a couple of farmers, to be part of a committee on disaster response. The county commissioners want to be proactive." Henry hesitated. Though he wasn't fond of meetings, he had to admit the idea made sense. The flood had exposed serious gaps in preparedness. He gave a slow nod. "All right. I can come to a meeting or two. Folks around here could use some real solutions." "That's all we're hoping for," Colton replied, handing Henry a small flyer with the time and place of the upcoming forum. When Henry entered the feed store, the cashier, Bonnie, gave him a wide grin. "Here you'll be working with the guard now, Henry. Didn't see that coming." He half smiled. "I'm not working for them, just telling them what I know." "That's more than most," Bonnie said, bagging his feed. "We're proud of you. Town's lucky to have you." If her tone made him blush, he hid it with a curt tip of his hat. Then he carried his bags outside, uneasy about his growing reputation as some type of local champion. 2 days later, Henry drove to the county building for the scheduled forum. He entered a cramped conference room to find a mix of faces. The county sheriff, a few city council members, the local fire chief, and a handful of farmers he recognized from neighboring properties. Lieutenant Colton and another guardsman stood at the front, notebooks in hand. Each participant introduced themselves. Then a white-haired councilwoman, Ms. Rourke, explained that they aimed to draft a better emergency plan. The conversation quickly turned to the condition of roads, the lack of advanced warning systems, and a scarcity of emergency vehicles. Henry listened quietly, noting that many suggestions felt overly grand, like they wanted to buy brand-new rescue boats or build expensive levees. He finally raised his hand. "All these big ideas are fine," he said, "but we still need common sense. Flood gauges along the main roads, for one. Maybe a direct line from the Weather Service to the local radio station. More volunteers with trucks or tractors who can help in a pinch. And we need safe places for folks to evacuate if the water rises fast." Lieutenant Colton nodded. "That's exactly the practical input we need, sir. Keep it coming." Henry wasn't used to the spotlight, but the group hung on his words. He talked about farmland drainage, pointing out how certain ditches overflowed at a fraction of the water level predicted by official charts. The sheriff scribbled notes. The fire chief nodded, and Ms. Rourke asked follow-up questions. By the end of the meeting, Henry realized he'd been speaking for nearly half an hour, sharing knowledge gleaned from decades of plowing fields by the river. When he walked out, Ms. Rourke stopped him in the hallway. "Henry, that was impressive. No politician or outside consultant could know as much about that floodplain as you do. Have you ever considered running for local office? We could use that kind of level-headed approach on the council." Her suggestion made him nearly choke on air. "Me, a politician? No, ma'am, that's not for me." She laughed gently. "Understood, but we'll keep picking your brain if you don't mind." "Fine," he said, quickly adding, "I'm glad if it helps." That night, Henry tried to settle back into his routine, feeding Bear, cooking a simple supper, and double-checking the fences he'd managed to patch. But though his body was tired, his mind buzzed with everything from that meeting. Perhaps in his reluctance to accept praise, he'd overlooked how his knowledge might actually benefit the entire community. He wasn't sure if he wanted to continue in any official capacity, but hearing Ms. Rourke's remark about local politics reminded him how drastically life can shift without warning. A day later, Henry got a letter in the mail from Mr. Saunders, the bus driver. Inside was a heartfelt note thanking Henry once more and explaining that the parents had pooled some funds for tractor repairs. Enclosed was a check that made Henry's eyes widen. He felt a knot in his stomach, torn between gratitude and pride. He asked himself whether refusing might offend them. After all, those families truly wanted to help. The check wouldn't make him rich, but it would cover fresh tires and some mechanical updates the tractor badly needed. Henry mulled it over, gazing out at his battered field. Bear sat beside him, ears perked, as though awaiting a decision. "We can use it," Henry murmured. The dog gave a small bark, as if in agreement. Taking that money wouldn't tarnish his sense of independence. It was a gift from people he had helped, a gesture that might, in its own way, allow them to feel some measure of closure. Still, part of him fretted over it. The following morning, he drove to the bus driver's home. Mr. Saunders greeted him on the porch, anxious to see how Henry felt. The farmer handed back half the check. "I'm grateful," he said. "More than I can say. But let's call this fair. I'll accept some help for the tractor, but I want the rest going to the kids' school. Maybe for new supplies or a field trip." Saunders looked emotional, eyes glistening, and nodded. "They'll be thrilled," he murmured, shaking Henry's hand. So, bit by bit, Henry tried to return to normal. Yet normal felt forever changed by that one day's events. Townspeople saw him differently. Word kept spreading well beyond Riverside, too. An assistant to a state representative called, asking if Henry would attend a local heroes banquet. A neighbor whispered about how the county might honor him again at the fall festival. Though he smiled politely, Henry worried that soon everyone would forget the bigger issues, like all the farmland ravaged by floods. He hoped the new committee would yield real action, not just ceremonies. Still, there were small signs of progress. Over by the Orchard Road, county workers installed a brand new flood gauge. Amateur radio operators formed a volunteer group, committing to broadcast urgent messages on local channels whenever the water rose unexpectedly. Even better, the first shipments of relief supplies arrived, a stack of sandbags, lumber for repairs, and some partial grant money. Henry heard some folks grumbling that it wasn't enough, but as far as he could tell, it was a start. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the sodden fields, Henry sat on his porch swing, watching dusk settle. Bear dozed at his feet. The farmland smelled of damp earth, and frogs had begun their evening chorus. The medal from the National Guard lay on the kitchen table inside, next to a photograph of Henry's father. Although he'd never set out to be recognized, Henry found himself reflecting on how connected everyone in Riverside truly was. The storm had hammered them, but folks came together to rescue kids, fix roads, and piece their lives back together. He cradled a mug of coffee, warmed by the memories of those he saved. In that quiet moment, Henry recognized a simple truth. In small towns, A single act of courage can ripple outward in unexpected ways. Those children would grow up remembering the farmer with the old tractor who braved a deadly flood. Maybe they would pay it forward someday. Maybe that was the best legacy a man could hope for. As darkness thickened, he rose, patted Bear, and headed inside. Tomorrow he'd tackle another row of broken fence posts, then check on a neighbor's field, then maybe stop by the county building. There was a lot to do, but for once, Henry McAllister had more help than he'd ever expected. He didn't know if he would keep attending those planning meetings or if he'd be content to remain a quiet voice on the sidelines. Either way, he felt certain that Riverside was moving toward a safer, stronger future. And though he would never fully embrace the title of hero, he knew that in times of crisis, a steady heart and a willing spirit could mean all the difference in the world. The following week, Henry found himself stepping onto the polished marble floors of Riverside's Municipal Hall, a place he'd rarely visited. He'd been invited to a gathering that had grown, in the local chatter, from a routine county meeting to a momentous event. Outside the building, uniformed National Guard personnel stood by their vehicles, while staff from the local mayor's office hustled around with clipboards. Henry adjusted the collar of his clean denim shirt, feeling out of place in such an official setting. Bear, left behind at the farm, would have sensed Henry's nerves if he'd been there. As Henry entered, Lieutenant Colton greeted him with a quick handshake and an encouraging nod. The soldier was all bright eyes and crisp posture, brimming with the positivity of someone who believed wholeheartedly in the mission at hand. "Glad you could make it," Colton said. Henry responded with a modest grin. Then he noticed Mr. Saunders and a few of the children from the bus, accompanied by parents. Seeing them gave him a rush of warmth, reminding him there was a purpose to all the formality. Now he wanted to do his best, if only to support these families who had endured so much in the flood. Inside the hall, rows of folding chairs had been arranged in front of a temporary stage. A few county commissioners gathered on one side, chatting in subdued tones with the sheriff. Henry found a seat near the back, unwilling to place himself at the center of things. A short while later, the mayor of Riverside, a bespectacled man named Julian Walters, walked up to the lectern. Clearing his throat into the microphone, Walters welcomed everyone and thanked them for coming. He explained that the session was meant to finalize a new community flood response plan, but the large turnout was also an opportunity to recognize those who displayed exceptional courage in the crisis. Henry shifted in his chair, guessing he was about to be singled out. Sure enough, the mayor continued, "We'd like to especially honor Henry McAllister, who risked his own safety to save a bus full of school children." A rousing round of applause echoed in the hall. Henry felt blood rush to his cheeks. He rose briefly, gave a nod, and sat down again. He wished the ground would swallow him, but the crowd seemed determined to shower him with gratitude. As the applause died down, the mayor held up a thick binder. "Now, let's discuss the strategic plan," Walters said. "We know how quickly this region can flood and the damage it can cause. We want everyone prepared. That means establishing better warning protocols, training volunteers, and identifying safe evacuation routes and shelters." A set of bullet points appeared on a screen behind him. Improved radio coordination, more robust flood gauges, volunteer training programs, and public announcements for every severe weather event. Henry, watching from the back, took note of how closely these ideas mirrored the input he'd given at smaller meetings. It was oddly gratifying to see his suggestions spelled out for the entire county to see. However, he also worried about the costs. Many farmers were stretched thin. How would they afford advanced equipment? Lieutenant Colton then stepped forward to outline the National Guard's role. They would set up weekend workshops to teach first aid, water rescue fundamentals, and basic survival tactics. "We'll rely on local experts, including Mr. McAllister," Colton added, glancing toward Henry. "If he's willing, we'd like him to do a demonstration on how everyday farm machinery can be used safely for rescue." A murmur spread among the crowd, most nodding enthusiastically. Henry swallowed hard. The thought of standing in front of folks, lecturing on rescue techniques, made him uneasy. He was a doer, not a speaker. Yet the sight of Mr. Saunders, standing next to a boy Henry recognized from the bus, young Timmy, who had clasped Henry's hand in gratitude after the rescue, reminded him that real knowledge could make a difference. If training local farmers meant more children would be spared danger, maybe he could manage it. With a deep breath, Henry gave a slow nod, and Colton beamed. They proceeded with the day's agenda. Several local ranchers voiced concerns, especially about costs and liabilities. A stout man named Amos Caldwell explained how a neighbor faced a lawsuit after an unsuccessful rescue attempt years ago. The sheriff clarified that new county legislation could protect volunteers from legal trouble if they acted in good faith. Another rancher asked about emergency funds for upgrading tractors or trucks to handle flooded roads. Ms. Rourke, from the council, promised to look into county grants. Meanwhile, the parents of some bus children described just how frightening it had been, stranded in the rising water. The mood shifted from tense debate to shared resolve, as though everyone agreed a flood like this last one shouldn't catch them unprepared again. By lunchtime, the county commissioners adopted a resolution. They would form a permanent Riverside Flood Response Task Force with seats for farmers, emergency officials, and everyday citizens who wanted to volunteer. Henry blinked at the list of names being read off. Hearing Henry McAllister among them caught him by surprise. After the meeting, small pockets of conversation sprang up around the hall. Henry, trying to slip out quietly, felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Timmy, the boy from the bus, clutching a homemade thank you card. Timmy's mother hovered nearby, smiling gently. "We wanted you to have this, Mr. Henry," Timmy said, offering up the card. It showed a bright crayon drawing of Henry's tractor, pulling a bus out of a river. Above it, he'd written, "Thank you for saving us." Henry's throat tightened. He crouched to Timmy's eye level, accepting the card with care. "This is mighty fine, Timmy," he managed to say. "I'll hang it where I can see it every day." The boy grinned. Meanwhile, Ms. Rourke sidled up, clearing her throat. "I see your name made the final roster. I suspect you didn't volunteer, but we need you." Henry glanced at the list in her hand. "I guess I have no choice," he joked, more resigned than displeased. She laughed. "We appreciate you more than you know, Henry." On the drive home, Henry mulled over his new obligations. The thought of monthly task force meetings and flood preparedness events daunted him, but a small voice inside insisted it was the right thing to do. He thought back to the day of the rescue, the swirling muddy water, the terror in those kids' eyes. If, by lending his expertise, he could ensure fewer close calls, wasn't it worth the discomfort of attending meetings? That night he set Timmy's card on the mantel beside the National Guard medal. His father's old photograph stood there too, a silent testament to the farm's history. Henry wondered what the elder McAllister would say if he were around. Probably that stepping up for the community was part of being a good neighbor. And if Henry had learned anything during that flood, it was how critical neighbors were in times of crisis. Soon, word of Henry's membership on the task force spread across Riverside. While most folks were supportive, a few naysayers sneered. One man, known for stirring trouble on local radio call-in shows, accused the county of wasting money on do-gooders. Another farmer, reeling from crop losses, grumbled that the committee wouldn't restore his ruined fields. Henry understood their frustration. The flood had inflicted real harm. Weeks later, farmland still lay drenched, and roads were pocked with fresh sinkholes. Recovery was slow, and the cost to fix everything soared higher than official funds. Yet Henry also saw a chance for solutions that might reduce heartbreak the next time nature raged. So when the first official meeting of the Riverside Flood Response Task Force was convened in the county building, he walked in with steely resolve. The group was diverse, Ms. Rourke representing the council, the sheriff offering law enforcement perspective, the fire chief discussing rescue logistics, and half a dozen volunteers from different walks of life. Henry recognized a retired teacher, a nurse from the clinic, and Amos Caldwell's sister, who managed a hardware store. Together, they formed a patchwork of experiences that, if harnessed properly, could lay a robust safety net across the region. They spent hours hashing out details, siren systems for the town center, agreements with local radio stations to broadcast alerts, text message notifications for cell phones, and a county website to track real-time water levels. Henry weighed in, focusing on farmland specifics. He spoke about clearing debris from drainage ditches, building berms, and marking safe tractor routes. Each suggestion was discussed, refined, or tabled for further investigation. By the end of the meeting, they all seemed exhausted, yet oddly energized. 2 weeks later, Henry found himself standing on a muddy patch of ground by the river, leading the first volunteer workshop. With Lieutenant Colton beside him, he demonstrated how to attach a towing chain securely to a tractor's rear hitch. The watchers, about 20 folks, ranged from shy teenagers to longtime locals. They stepped closer, taking notes or snapping pictures. Henry took them step by step through the rescue scenario he'd faced, explaining how weight distribution mattered, how to test the ground's stability, and why you had to keep your wheels out of the strongest current if possible. He got flustered once or twice, knowing cameras were rolling, but the sincerity of those listening steadied him. One lady, wearing rubber boots splashed with mud, raised her hand. "If we see someone stranded, how do we know the water's not too deep for the tractor?" Henry answered, "If you can't judge the depth, you consider it too deep. You never risk the vehicle unless you're positive it can handle it." He remembered the stomach-lurching moment when his tractor nearly tipped. That fear flashed through him, but he pressed on, determined to equip these volunteers with caution and knowledge. As the workshop concluded, people shook Henry's hand, expressing gratitude for what they learned. Lieutenant Colton clapped him on the shoulder, proud of how well the demonstration went. "You've got a knack for teaching, Henry," he remarked. Henry only chuckled, unconvinced he was teacher material. Nevertheless, he felt a glow of accomplishment. This was doing some real good. On the way back to the farm, he found himself whistling a quiet tune. The day had been long, but productive. By now, Bear was probably eager for supper, and Henry had chores waiting. He'd have to mail in a form for the newly created county relief program, which offered partial reimbursements for lost crops. Even if it amounted to a small sum, it might help with repairs. Best of all, more volunteers were signing up for the next workshop, which would focus on first aid and triage. The question in Henry's mind was whether, after all these measures, Riverside would truly be ready when the next big flood came. He suspected floods were unstoppable forces, but now the community would face them with a deeper sense of unity and preparation. That thought comforted him. At least no farmer or bus driver would be blindsided by fast-rising water again, not without some kind of warning or plan. Henry's days had taken on a rhythm he never expected. Mornings were spent tending the farm, milking his 2 aging cows, checking the fences he'd patched since the flood, and walking the rows of stunted corn to see what might still be salvaged. After lunch, he often drove into town for meetings, workshops, or one of the countless quick consultations someone inevitably requested. He found himself sharing everything from advice on tractor maintenance to tips for cleaning irrigation ditches. Townspeople liked calling him the expert, a title that made him chuckle, as though a lifetime of sweat and dirt were credentials he'd never dreamed of. Whenever Henry considered scaling back these volunteer commitments, someone else seemed to need him. One Thursday, the principal of Riverside Elementary phoned and asked if he'd speak to the older students about flood safety. Initially, he hesitated, uncertain how to handle a classroom of curious kids. Still, the memory of that bus perched over a swirling current weighed heavily in his mind. If a single talk could spare them future danger, he figured he ought to give it a shot. So he arrived at the school, feeling overdressed in khaki pants and a freshly laundered plaid shirt. The entire 6th grade assembled in the library, eyes bright and watchful. The principal, Mrs. Faulkner, introduced him in glowing terms, calling him the man who saved a bus full of Riverside's finest. Henry gave a modest wave, his heart pounding. He wasn't used to an audience, let alone one that hung on his every word. But as he told them about the power of floodwaters, encouraging them to listen for evacuation orders and never cross rushing streams, he relaxed. The children asked thoughtful questions. How deep was the water? Were you scared? What kind of tractor do you drive? By the end, Henry was smiling at their enthusiasm and realized they'd taught him something important. Sometimes, it takes a near tragedy to remind people how precious life is. That afternoon, after finishing up at the school, Henry dropped by the hardware store for nails and lumber. He was halfway to the exit when a familiar face appeared, Amos Caldwell, the outspoken rancher who'd been reluctant about the new flood response plans. Amos looked uneasy, fiddling with his battered straw hat. "Henry," he mumbled, I'm sorry I gave you such a hard time. I just worried it was all talk, but the county's starting to fix culverts near my place. I suppose your group had a hand in that." Henry set the lumber aside. "It's not my group, Amos. We all pitched in. But I'm glad the county listened to farmers who said those culverts needed upgrading." Amos managed a faint smile. "Me too. Keep it up. I'm tired of worrying every time storm clouds roll in." Then, clearing his throat, Amos added, "Heard you're teaching folks rescue skills. If you ever need an extra tractor or set of hands, let me know." That spontaneous offer felt like a small victory. Henry clapped Amos on the shoulder and said, "I appreciate it. Next workshop's in 2 weeks, so come by if you can." As he left, Henry felt a flicker of hope that the entire community was pulling in the same direction, piece by piece. Meanwhile, Henry was still dealing with his own post-flood challenges. One of his cornfields lay half-submerged for so long that the yield was minimal. Though the county had arranged partial reimbursements, it wouldn't cover every loss. Each morning he confronted the battered fields and did his best to salvage what remained. He consoled himself with the thought that, come next planting season, the soil might recover if he worked in some new nutrients. Farming was always a gamble. This year had simply been crueler than most. In the evenings, when he finally sat on his porch with Bear snoozing at his feet, Henry thought about the future. Sometimes he worried that all these committees and training sessions might fade as soon as the memory of the flood dimmed. The town's short attention span could revert to old habits, letting planning documents gather dust. But other times, he believed a permanent transformation was underway, that they'd become a place that valued preparedness and neighborly cooperation. He saw it in the revived farmland that people tried so hard to protect, and in the way local families wanted to learn about safety measures. Perhaps they'd keep making progress. A quiet Sunday arrived, the kind of morning that dawned cloudless with crisp air. Henry allowed himself a half-day of rest, drifting through mild chores like gathering eggs. Then he heard an engine outside. To his surprise, it was Ms. Rourke, pulling up in a small sedan. She stepped out impeccably dressed for a Sunday, though the roads were still muddy. After greeting Bear with a quick pat, she walked to Henry's front porch. "Henry, good morning," she said, smiling politely. "I'm sorry to drop by unannounced, but I wanted to give you some news. The county commissioners are impressed with the progress on flood response planning, and they'd like you to help represent Riverside at a statewide emergency preparedness conference next month. It's in the capital, all expenses paid. A couple of us will be going, but we'd like you to join as our local expert." The shock must have shown on his face. She chuckled softly. "I know it's unexpected, but we'll cover the cost. Would you consider it?" Henry wiped his hands on his worn jeans. I'm not sure I'm suited for conferences and all that." The notion of traveling hours away, speaking to officials and professionals from across the state, made him uneasy. "I mean, I'm a farmer, not an emergency manager." "That's exactly why we want you, Ms." Rourke explained, her voice earnest. "They'll have plenty of professionals, but you bring first-hand perspective that can't be learned from a textbook. You understand the real challenges people face on the ground. We need that voice in the conversation." Henry gazed out at his cornfield, thinking of the tasks still waiting. But he also recalled how many times in recent weeks he'd told people they had to share knowledge to make real progress. Would refusing this invitation be hypocritical? He cleared his throat. "All right," he said at last. "If the county wants me, I'll go. Just don't expect me to give some fancy speech." Ms. Rourke smiled, relief plain on her face. "Thank you, Henry. We'll keep it as painless as possible, I promise." Before leaving, she handed him a packet of information. "Here's the schedule. We'll coordinate travel later." After she drove off, Henry stood on the porch, flipping through the papers. Titles like "Leveraging Volunteer Networks and Strengthening Rural Infrastructure" leapt off the pages. It seemed serious indeed. He couldn't help a small grin at the idea of a simple farmer from Riverside stepping into a grand conference hall to discuss floods and safety. Time had a way of turning life upside down. A few days later, Henry was back at the county building for the second official meeting of the Flood Response Task Force. He told the group about the upcoming conference. Ms. Rourke chimed in, explaining that the state was paying attention to Riverside's example of grassroots collaboration. While some members clapped with excitement, the sheriff, an older man named Diggs, took Henry aside after the meeting. "Word of caution," Diggs said, voice low. "You'll do fine up there, but watch out for smooth talkers who'll promise you the moon. Not everyone sees floods and farmland the way we do." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "I'll keep that in mind. I'm no politician, so maybe they won't notice me anyway." Diggs gave a wry smile. "I think they'll notice you more than you expect. That bus rescue made a lot of headlines, you know." When Henry returned home, he found his mailbox stuffed with letters. The usual bills and flyers were joined by a small envelope with a state seal. Inside was a note from the office of the governor, offering personal thanks for Henry's service to Riverside during the flood. It included a polite invitation to visit the governor's mansion if he was in the capital for the conference. Henry sighed, feeling out of his depth. He set the note aside, deciding to tackle one challenge at a time. The rest of that week, he balanced farm life with workshop planning. Lieutenant Colton asked him to co-lead a session on personal preparedness kits, an odd topic for a man whose own kit rarely extended beyond a toolbox and some spare rope. Still, Henry recognized the value in teaching people to pack flashlights, water, blankets, or first aid supplies. While rummaging in his barn for demonstration items, he felt a pang of remembrance at the chain he'd once used to pull the bus out of the flood. The links were still scarred, a mute testament to how quickly water could become lethal. At the next volunteer session by the river, Henry demonstrated how to check for submerged obstacles and measure current speed using a rope with knots. Attendees asked question after question, scribbling in notepads. He displayed water pumps, sandbags, and spades for building a quick barrier. The notion that he was some authority still puzzled him, but he couldn't deny the sense of purpose. As he glanced at the crowd, a handful of children watched with wide eyes, probably curious to see the man who had rescued their classmates. Henry tried to set a confident example, reminding them never to attempt a dangerous crossing unless they were fully prepared. Afterwards, Henry wandered over to a worn bench near the water's edge. His mind drifted to the approaching date of the conference. He pictured a cavernous hall, men in suits carrying briefcases, slideshows of city flood defense systems, and that hush that falls before a speaker addresses a crowd. He imagined them calling his name and him rising, adjusting his hat, clearing his throat nervously. He chuckled to himself, half in dread, half in amusement at how life had changed. But maybe, he mused, Traveling beyond Riverside to share their story would do some good. The bus rescue had been dramatic, but the real success was how the whole town had rallied afterward. If other communities could adopt something like Riverside's volunteer spirit, families might be safer, farmers might feel less isolated. That hope nudged him toward acceptance of his strange new role. Evening came, painting the sky with oranges and pinks. Bear trotted beside Henry as they headed back to the pickup. He gave one last look at the gently flowing river, so serene now compared to that terrible day. Even though it was calm, he felt respect for the forces of nature and an unexpected gratitude for the chance to help others appreciate those forces as well. Soon, the next adventure awaited: a trip to the capital, a seat at the table of statewide emergency response planning. Henry inhaled the crisp air. If this was the path life had opened, he'd give it his best. A single act of rescue had set so many things in motion, and he was gradually learning that the true measure of heroism wasn't the dramatic moment itself, but the willingness to carry its lessons forward for the good of everyone. Henry woke up before dawn on the day he was due to travel to the state capital. His truck was fueled, an overnight bag packed with a spare shirt, and the best pair of pants he owned, which still bore faint stains from a previous year's harvest. He had arranged for a neighbor to keep an eye on Bear and check the livestock. Though not entirely comfortable leaving the farm in someone else's care, Henry reminded himself this journey was necessary. The conference would last 2 days, enough time to glean ideas for Riverside's flood preparedness and share his own experiences. Still, as he sipped his morning coffee, he couldn't suppress a twinge of anxiety. By 7 o'clock, Miss Rourke pulled into his driveway, accompanied by a county commissioner named Grant Ellis. They'd carpool together for the 3-hour drive. Henry double-checked he had everything: a small folder containing notes about Riverside's volunteer efforts, some brochures detailing the workshops, and a worn spiral notebook where he'd scribbled any relevant data. "Ready as I'll ever be," he told them, climbing into the passenger seat of Ms. Rourke's sedan. They set off, bumping down the rural roads until they reached the highway that led north. For the first hour, conversation flowed easily. They discussed the farm losses from the flood, the slow but steady repairs, and the success of recent training sessions. Grant Ellis, a soft-spoken man with salt and pepper hair, praised Henry's efforts. "We've never had so many folks sign up to learn about emergency procedures," Grant said. "It's stirring up real changes, not just talk." Henry felt both pride and a pang of pressure, hoping he wouldn't let anyone down at the conference. Ms. Rourke asked if Henry had prepared an official speech, but he shook his head. "I'm no public speaker," he said. "I figure I'll just answer questions if they come my way." When they arrived in the bustling capital city, Henry was struck by the tall buildings and busy streets. He rarely ventured beyond Riverside's county lines, and the vastness of the place left him momentarily overwhelmed. Ms. Rourke navigated toward a modern conference center where they parked among rows of vehicles from across the state. Volunteers in bright vests directed them inside, where a registration table was set up. Henry marveled at the polished floors, the overhead lighting, and the steady hum of voices echoing through the corridors. After signing in, they discovered they had just enough time to check into their nearby hotel before the first panel. Henry carried his small bag to a modest room that felt too fancy for his tastes. Crisp white sheets, thick curtains, and a television bigger than any he'd ever seen. He set his folder on the small desk and took a moment to gather his thoughts. This would be his home base for 2 nights. Stepping into the hallway, he spotted Grant Ellis, who gave him a reassuring nod. "We'll do fine, Henry," Grant said, as though sensing Henry's nerves. They headed back to the conference center, passing through an atrium filled with informational booths. Agencies displayed brochures on flood insurance, climate data, and emergency management software. Henry meandered among them, politely shaking hands with people who introduced themselves as city planners or hydrology experts. A few recognized him from news articles about the bus rescue. They offered enthusiastic greetings that made him feel a bit self-conscious. He overheard phrases like grassroots hero and practical knowledge. Though Henry wasn't chasing fame, he realized his story carried weight here. The first session took place in a large auditorium. The stage featured a podium with a projector screen behind it and seats arranged in rows. Ms. Rourke, sitting beside Henry and Grant, whispered that the session would include policy updates, letting local representatives voice concerns about budget constraints. Henry listened attentively as a series of speakers talked about strategic floodplain mapping and advanced warning networks. They used jargon and acronyms Henry found hard to track. At times, his mind drifted, reflecting on how different this was from the tangible, hands-on approach he preferred. During a break, Ms. Rourke introduced Henry to a tall woman in a crisp navy suit, Deputy Director Margaret Sweeney from the state's Emergency Management Department. She extended a firm handshake. "I've read about the bus incident, Mr. McAllister," Sweeney said, her voice both warm and precise. "I'd love to pick your brain about volunteer-based rescues. We find that rural areas respond more quickly when local folks take initiative." Henry nodded, hoping he sounded coherent. "Sure, there's a limit to what volunteers can do, but in a pinch, they can fill gaps until professionals arrive." Sweeney listened thoughtfully, then invited him to join a small round table later in the day. "We want to hear from actual field experience, not just the textbooks," she explained. Henry agreed, though the idea of a round table made him feel a flutter of nerves. Back in the auditorium, the governor herself made an appearance, stepping on stage with a polished smile. She gave a short speech about strengthening the state's resilience to natural disasters, fires, floods, tornadoes, and how local heroes like Henry reminded everyone of what community spirit could accomplish. Although no one mentioned him by name during the speech, Henry guessed she was referencing his story when she talked about the farmer who saved a bus full of children. Applause rippled through the crowd at the mention. He tried to remain inconspicuous, but Ms. Rourke smirked knowingly from the next seat. The day progressed in a blur of presentations and panels. Henry found some of it fascinating, particularly the session on cost sharing for levee repairs and the demonstration of simple water-level sensors farmers could install themselves. Other parts seemed distant from Riverside's reality, focusing on multi-million-dollar infrastructure that no small county could afford. By late afternoon, Henry felt both tired and invigorated, his notebook full of scribbled ideas he wanted to share back home. That evening, the conference organizers hosted a reception in the lobby of a nearby museum. Soft music played, and attendees mingled over refreshments. Henry nearly skipped it, preferring to rest in his hotel room, but Grant Ellis convinced him to come along and meet more people. Wearing his best shirt and the same slightly scuffed boots, Henry entered the fancy venue. It reminded him of a wedding reception, tables of finger foods, small clusters of guests sipping drinks, and an overall air of polite conversation. He drifted among the exhibits, feeling out of place. Then he spotted Ms. Rourke speaking with Margaret Sweeney near a tall sculpture. She waved him over with a friendly smile. As soon as he approached, Sweeney gestured for him to join their conversation. "We were just discussing local bridging solutions," she said. "Many rural roads rely on old, low-capacity bridges that become impassable after heavy rain. Mr. McAllister, have you seen that problem out your way?" Henry nodded. "A lot of smaller bridges near Riverside date back decades. Some are in bad shape. We had to tow a neighbor's truck out of the creek just last week because the approach gave way. That's not uncommon." Sweeney looked concerned. "Any plan to fix them?" "Well, there's talk of a county bond measure," Henry explained, "but it's slow going. Funding is always an issue." She sighed sympathetically, then took a business card from her pocket. "If your task force hits a wall, reach out. We might find partial grants or match programs. I can't guarantee results, but we have to start somewhere." Henry accepted the card, realizing that maybe the real value of this conference wasn't just gleaning knowledge, but also forging connections. If a phone call to Margaret Sweeney could jumpstart improvements for Riverside's roads, that alone might justify the trip. At the buffet table, Henry ran into the bus driver, Mr. Saunders, who had come with another group from the county. Saunders laughed, saying, "Never thought I'd see the day we'd be at a fancy function like this, Henry." He patted Henry's shoulder affectionately. "But look at us, representing the place we call home." Henry grinned. He asked how the kids were doing, and Saunders said they still talked about Henry's tractor. That made Henry's chest feel tight with a bittersweet emotion. He realized that, as time passed, maybe these kids would remember that close call as part of a bigger lesson about community, rather than pure fear. Later, Ms. Rourke coaxed Henry into introducing himself to the governor, who was making rounds at each small group. He felt his palms sweat as the governor approached, but she set him at ease with a warm handshake. "I believe we have you to thank for a remarkable story of heroism," she remarked, eyes bright. Henry tried to deflect the praise. "Just did what needed doing," he said, repeating his usual line. The governor smiled knowingly. "That's how true heroes always put it." She listened to a brief summary of Riverside's progress in building a volunteer network, then encouraged Henry and Ms. Rourke to reach out if the state could facilitate further support. The next morning came with a final round of workshops. Henry was scheduled to appear at the Local Stories Statewide Solutions Roundtable alongside 4 other individuals, including a coastal fisherman who'd rescued neighbors from storm surge. Henry's heart pounded as he took his seat at a long table on a low platform. About 30 people filled the small audience area, notebooks and laptops at the ready. The moderator asked each panelist to share their experience. When his turn arrived, Henry cleared his throat. He explained how Riverside had always been a tight-knit farming community, but the recent flood caught them off guard. He told how the bus ended up stranded, described hooking a chain to his old tractor, and how after that day everyone realized how unprepared they'd been. "We're working on that now," he said quietly. Folks joined together, started learning from each other. We formed a task force. It's changing how we think about safety, and if there's one thing I hope folks take away, it's that we can't rely on luck alone. Applause broke out. The fisherman beside him offered a respectful nod. The moderator asked about volunteer training, and Henry outlined the workshops he and Lieutenant Colton had organized. A city councilwoman from another region asked how they finance supplies. Henry admitted they scraped by with small grants, local donors, and folks sharing what they could. "Maybe bigger programs can help," he said, remembering Margaret Sweeney's card in his pocket. "But we do the best with what we have." When the session ended, Henry was swarmed by people wanting more details, from town clerks to emergency managers from across the state. They asked about the farmland's drainage, how Henry handled the bus rescue chain, and whether Riverside used a phone tree system or text alerts for citizens. He answered as best he could, occasionally deferring official data to the county commissioners. By the time the crowd dispersed, Henry felt dazed and a little breathless. Yet he also felt a spark of hope. Perhaps other places would replicate Riverside's approach and adapt it to their own hazards. Floods, wildfires, hurricanes, or something else. That afternoon, he returned to the hotel, packed his belongings, and prepared for the drive home. As they left the Capitol, Ms. Rourke and Grant Ellis praised Henry for his calm, direct manner in the roundtable. "You made an impact," Ms. Rourke said, turning onto the highway. "They see a normal man stepping up for his community, and that resonates with people far more than fancy speeches." Grant Ellis added that they'd been invited to submit a written summary of Riverside's volunteer strategy for the official conference proceedings. Henry agreed to help draft it, wondering how he'd ever put it all into words. On the journey home, farmland once again replaced skyscrapers in Henry's view. The sun drifted lower, painting the sky with gold. He thought of Bear waiting for him, of the fields needing attention and the next volunteer workshop. It felt good to return to the quiet of Riverside, but something had shifted for Henry. He'd seen how wide the world was, how eager people were to find real, workable solutions. He recognized that his role as a humble farmer had unexpectedly placed him in a spotlight, urging him to keep pushing for better preparedness. Yes, Henry reflected, as Ms. Rourke's sedan rumbled past roadside barns. He'd keep doing what needed to be done. That's what had started this entire journey, after all, doing what needed doing in a crisis. And now, maybe, he'd do it on a bigger stage, still a farmer at heart, but ready to guide others. Henry stepped out of Ms. Rourke's sedan in front of his farmhouse, feeling both relieved and oddly wistful. The trip to the capital had been more successful than he'd imagined. He'd exchanged contact information with several officials, Margaret Sweeney among them, and come away with a sense that Riverside's modest approach to disaster readiness might be replicated elsewhere. Bear bounded up, tail wagging, as if Henry had been gone a month instead of 2 days. Chuckling, Henry bent to rub the dog's ears, then turned to wave Ms. Rourke and Grant Ellis goodbye. The pair drove off with a friendly honk, leaving him to the comforting silence of the countryside. Inside, Henry found the mail stacked on his kitchen table. Bills, advertisements, and a short letter from the local 4-H club caught his eye. The letter described an upcoming county fair, with a request for Henry to judge a new exhibit about farm equipment maintenance and emergency preparedness. He shook his head in mild disbelief. It seemed that every corner of the community now wanted his perspective. Carefully placing the letter aside, he reminded himself that the flood's aftermath extended beyond physical repairs. People in Riverside wanted knowledge, and if he could provide it, so be it. Before he did anything else, Henry headed back out to check on his fields. Driving the tractor carefully along the perimeter, he surveyed the state of his corn. Flood debris still cluttered the edges, but the ground was less swampy than it had been. He estimated that, with luck, a portion might be salvageable. He also noted that the brand-new flood gauge the county had installed by the ditch was still upright, a small testament to the changes begun after the disaster. Maybe next season, he mused, they'd be able to anticipate trouble in time to spare themselves heartbreak. Midway along the field, Henry met Amos Caldwell, who was tinkering with a fence post on the adjoining property. Amos greeted Henry with something akin to warmth. They talked about the capital trip, about the demands of winterizing farmland, and about more volunteers who wanted tractor training sessions in case heavy rains returned. Amos confided that, even though it humbled him to rely on official help, he was grateful for how quickly some repairs had been funded. Henry listened, grateful that the tension between them had thawed. "We're in this together, after all," Henry said. Amos nodded, looking thoughtful in the crisp autumn sunlight. Over the next week, Henry juggled farm chores with a flurry of phone calls. Margaret Sweeney left a message thanking him for sharing Riverside's experiences at the conference, saying she intended to visit once her schedule allowed. Ms. Rourke asked for help drafting that written summary of the county's volunteer strategy. Even Timmy, the boy from the bus rescue, wrote a letter inviting Henry to career day at the school, saying, "We want to learn about your tractor." Henry couldn't help but smile at the childlike sincerity. He wrote back that he'd be honored to attend, though the idea of standing in front of a classroom still made him anxious. Meanwhile, the Flood Response Task Force arranged another workshop, this time focusing on basic boat safety and water rescues using inflatable rafts. The local volunteer fire department had some old equipment they wanted to repurpose, hoping to station small rescue boats at key points along the river. Henry wasn't sure how often those boats would be used, but Lieutenant Colton emphasized how just one saved life would justify the cost. Remembering the bus teetering on that creek's edge, Henry wholeheartedly agreed. As Henry prepared for the new workshop, he decided to incorporate real-life drills. He and the volunteer firefighters marked a shallow stretch of the river, setting up a scenario with a mock stranded vehicle and a few volunteers acting as victims. On the appointed Saturday, a decent crowd gathered by the riverbank, watching as the firefighters demonstrated paddling techniques, anchor usage, and safe approaches against the current. Then, Henry showed them how to hitch a rope securely from land to the vehicle, making sure everyone understood the hazards of tension lines in moving water. Curious onlookers, including families with children, observed from the sidelines. Some had phones out to record. Henry noticed Timmy among them, eyes shining. The boy waved, and Henry returned the gesture with a small salute, mindful that this kid had lived through a real rescue. At the end of the demonstration, the crowd clapped. One father declared he felt more confident about emergency situations, and a mother said she wished training like this had been available sooner. Henry thanked them with humble words, noting that the best time to prepare was always before disaster struck. As the day wound down, Henry climbed onto his tractor to clear away some debris. He was joined by a group of teenage volunteers who offered to help pick up trash and old branches along the riverbank. The group was part of a youth program that wanted to earn community service hours. Their enthusiasm reminded Henry of something Margaret Sweeney had said at the conference, that bridging generations was key to sustaining any preparedness plan. He showed the teens how to stack fallen limbs safely, explaining which bits of driftwood might prove hazardous if the water rose again. They listened politely, though one or two cast sideways glances at the battered tractor that had become so legendary. When the cleanup was done, Henry found a moment to stand quietly at the river's edge, reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. A few months ago, no one had given a second thought to flood protocol. Now they were holding workshops, drafting official documents, and building small rescue stations. And Henry himself, a man who once preferred solitude on his land, had become a teacher and advocate. Life had a way of steering you toward unexpected roads. That evening, Henry drove home feeling a touch of fatigue, but also genuine satisfaction. He stowed the tractor in the barn, gave Bear a hearty scratch behind the ears, and headed indoors to fix a simple supper. While he waited for the kettle to boil, he sorted the day's mail. One piece stood out, a formal invitation from the county commissioners to attend a special ceremony next month. They were planning to dedicate a new flood memorial plaque near the main bridge in town, commemorating how the community had rallied after the disaster. Henry sighed, unsurprised that they wanted him there. He wondered how many ceremonies and plaques would appear before people considered Riverside truly healed. Still, healing took many forms. He recalled how Amos Caldwell had once grumbled that all these efforts were pointless. Now Amos was volunteering at every workshop, eager to protect his own farmland and help neighbors do the same. Mr. Saunders had resumed driving the school bus, calmer for knowing the region was better prepared. Even Timmy's mother had joined the newly formed Neighbors Helping Neighbors phone tree. Sometimes a single crisis, harrowing as it was, could sow the seeds of lasting unity. Right before bed, Henry stepped onto the porch, gazing out into the night. The horizon was a soft blur, the air still. Overhead, stars sparkled in a moonless sky. He felt a hush descend, reminding him of nights spent wondering if tomorrow would bring storms. Now, if storms came, at least they would not face them alone. The swirl of plans and committees might not guarantee safety, but it bound people together in a shared sense of responsibility. That, Henry believed, was the real victory. Breathing deeply, he patted the porch railing, letting the silence envelop him. Tomorrow would bring fresh work, but tonight, there was peace and the promise of better days. Henry woke the next morning to the pale sunlight filtering across his land, illuminating the lingering flood debris in the distance. He wondered how much longer he and his neighbors would find bits of driftwood tangled in fences, or deposits of silt where rows of corn ought to be. Brushing off the thought, he rose to feed Bear, then moved on to his usual chores. Checking the barn, making sure the water trough for the livestock was clean, and inspecting a repaired portion of fence for loose nails. The autumn air felt brisk, promising winter's arrival in a matter of weeks. Over breakfast, Henry flipped on the local radio, letting the quiet voice of the morning announcer fill his kitchen. Between songs, the announcer mentioned the county commissioners were planning a special dedication for the new memorial plaque near Riverside's main bridge, inviting the public to attend. A short note followed, something about the bus rescue that occurred months earlier and how it had spurred the town's renewed emphasis on emergency planning. Henry sighed, stirring his coffee. He still wasn't used to hearing that story shared so casually, as if it were just a bit of local legend. Around mid-morning, Henry drove his old pickup to the hardware store in town, needing fresh lumber for a small repair to the chicken coop. The main road into Riverside was smoother now. County crews had finally fixed the worst potholes caused by the flood. Passing the rebuilt shoulders and newly installed markers warning of high water, he felt a small surge of pride. They really were making progress, one piece at a time. In the hardware store lot, he spotted Margaret Sweeney stepping out of a rental car, wearing a sensible jacket and sturdy boots. She caught sight of him and waved. Henry nodded, surprised to see the deputy director in town already. He'd heard she might visit, but no one had confirmed the date. "Mr. McAllister," she greeted, walking over with a professional smile. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced. I had a meeting with the county commissioners this afternoon, and they suggested I take a look around. Mind showing me a few spots where you train those volunteers?" Henry adjusted his cap, a bit flustered. "Of course. Wasn't expecting you so soon, but I'm glad to help." He paused, glancing at the hardware store. "I just need to grab a few boards, then we can head wherever you like." Margaret waited patiently while Henry finished his quick purchase, then joined him in the truck. As they drove, she explained that the state was developing a new pilot program aimed at empowering local communities to handle minor emergencies before outside help arrived. "We'd like to consider Riverside as a model," Margaret said. "Our hope is that we can replicate your training workshops, your volunteer structure, maybe even your phone tree system in other rural areas." Henry gripped the wheel, absorbing the implication that Riverside might turn into a template for others. "That's flattering," he said carefully, "but I hope we're up to the task. There's still plenty we haven't figured out." "That's exactly the point," Margaret answered, a note of enthusiasm in her voice. "You're honest about your limitations. The key is your willingness to learn and adapt. We'd rather support that than push top-down mandates that might not fit." They arrived at the stretch of river where the last workshop had been held. The site was quiet now, leaves drifting across the water's surface. Henry parked near a clearing, then led Margaret along the bank, showing her how they'd set up rope lines for practicing water rescues. He pointed out a shallow area used for mock vehicle retrievals, describing the steps they'd demonstrated with volunteer firefighters. Margaret listened intently, occasionally jotting notes in a small pad. "I love that this is so hands-on," she remarked. "Communities often get stuck in endless planning sessions, but here, it looks like you just jumped in with practical drills." Henry smiled. "Might be because we learned the hard way. We almost lost a bus full of kids before we realized how unprepared we were. Now, we figure it's better to do something than just talk about it." They strolled further, stopping by the newly installed siren pole that the county had erected. When Margaret asked how it was activated, Henry explained that the sheriff's office could trigger it if river gauges indicated dangerously high water. He also mentioned the volunteer radio network that would relay warnings to more remote farms. Margaret seemed impressed. "This is exactly the type of integrated approach we encourage, a blend of official systems and grassroots effort." By the time they returned to Henry's pickup, early afternoon sunshine pierced through scattered clouds. Margaret asked if she could see Henry's farm too, curious about how he was coping with post-flood life. He hesitated, not wanting to appear rude, but then realized her interest was genuine. "All right, ma'am," he said. "Not much to look at, but I'll show you around." A short drive later, they turned onto Henry's gravel lane. The dog, as usual, lay in the yard, ears perking up at the sight of a newcomer. Margaret greeted Bear with a friendly pat, then surveyed the property. Henry led her into the barn, pointing out where the water had reached during the worst of the flood. A distinct line, still faintly visible on the wooden boards, showed how high it had climbed. She whistled softly. "That's above waist level," she noted. "Must have been terrifying." "Sure was," Henry murmured. "But we were lucky. The real trouble happened closer to town, near those old roads. And of course, that bus with the kids." He gently kicked a small fragment of driftwood aside. "Bear's still a little jumpy around storms. I don't blame him." Margaret nodded empathetically. Then she asked Henry more about the tractor. Did he modify it in any special way for the rescue? With a wry chuckle, Henry admitted it was standard equipment, just well maintained. "It's half a century old, was my father's before me. I guess it has a bit of stubborn fight left in it, same as I do." When they stepped back outside, Margaret paused to scan the horizon. "It's peaceful here," she said, inhaling the clean air. "Hard to imagine a raging flood tearing through these fields, but disasters can strike anywhere." Henry gave a small nod. "We learned that lesson all too well." He dug into his jacket pocket, retrieving a folded note. "Ma'am, I've jotted down some ideas that the volunteers keep bringing up. Stuff about forming better ties with local churches, maybe training a handful of folks in advanced medical care. We don't have a hospital close by." Margaret took the note with gratitude, scanning the bullet points. "Excellent suggestions. We might be able to funnel resources through the pilot program. Funding for paramedic training or placing medical kits at key spots. Let me follow up. This is exactly what we need to highlight." They discussed the possibilities a while longer. Eventually, Margaret noticed the time and apologized for needing to meet the commissioners soon. Before leaving, she extended her hand. "Henry, I'm genuinely impressed. I'll return in a few weeks with more details. If everything aligns, Riverside could become a featured success story statewide. Would you be willing to speak at a bigger forum if we get that set up?" Henry felt the old flutter of nerves, but he forced a nod. "I'll do what I can, long as it helps people stay safe." Smiling, Margaret thanked him and got back in her rental car. Henry watched her drive off, exhaling in relief. Interacting with so many officials lately tested his comfort zone, but he couldn't deny that real progress seemed possible. He scratched Bear's ears, saying quietly, "We might be busier than ever, boy." The rest of the afternoon, Henry worked on the chicken coop repairs, the boards he'd bought at the hardware store lying ready at his feet. As he hammered nails, he thought about how everything felt different since that flood. Busier, more connected, and full of small steps toward better resilience. It humbled him to see the interest from higher authorities, yet it also validated the long hours spent offering workshops and advice. That evening the phone rang, and Henry picked up to hear Timmy's cheerful voice. The boy asked if Henry remembered his promise for Career Day next week. Henry confirmed he'd be there, ignoring the knot in his stomach at standing before a crowd of kids. Timmy rattled off questions he planned to ask, such as how old Henry was when he learned to drive a tractor or how to fix a flat tire on farmland. Henry chuckled, telling Timmy he'd prepare answers. After hanging up, he paced around the living room, wrestling with a mixture of amusement and apprehension. First the round table at the state conference, now a second-grade career day. Life certainly had turned upside down, but if talking to those kids helped them dream beyond themselves, maybe even become tomorrow's rescue volunteers, then it was worth every minute. Late that night, Henry brewed a small pot of tea and sat at his kitchen table. He rummaged for a pen and a scrap of paper, writing down ideas for Timmy's classmates, bullet points about farm chores, equipment basics, and a personal anecdote about the bus rescue. Bear lounged on the floor, yawning. In the lamplight, Henry realized he felt oddly content. Weeks of balancing farm duties with new responsibilities had become normal. He wasn't sure how long that sense of purpose would last, but he planned to ride it out as best he could. He finished his tea, tucked away the notes for Timmy's questions, and stood to turn off the lights. Outside, the moonless sky was scattered with stars, shimmering over a land that had recovered from one flood, but would surely face more trials in the future. A faint breeze rustled the trees, and Henry closed his eyes, letting the night's calm settle over him. Life had changed, and so had he. Yet in every meeting, every training session, he felt an unwavering commitment to protect his community. And as he climbed the creaking stairs to bed, he recognized how far a single moment of courage could carry him, how it could shape not just a man's destiny, but the destiny of a whole town. Over the next few days, Henry's life revolved around farmland chores, volunteer planning sessions, and the anticipation of speaking to Timmy's class. He found himself running behind on tasks he once completed with ease. Waking at dawn, he hurried through feeding the livestock and hauling fresh water to the trough, often skipping lunch to make it into town for short-notice meetings with the Flood Response Task Force. Afterward, he rushed back home, only to discover some new request from a neighbor or an email from the county commissioners. He told himself the bus rescue had changed his fortunes in ways he never expected, and a part of him couldn't deny how good it felt to be needed. Even so, he occasionally missed his old routine, the quiet days spent working his fields with just Bear at his side. On the morning of Timmy's career day, Henry dressed in a neatly pressed shirt and his only pair of slacks that hadn't seen farm labor. After checking on Bear and leaving extra feed for the hens, he headed off in the pickup, trying to rehearse in his mind the points he wanted to cover about farming and flood safety. As he pulled into the gravel lot of Riverside Elementary, the sight of children playing in the yard brought a soft smile to his face. He parked under a wide oak tree and gathered a small box of visual aids, a worn tractor part, a coil of rescue rope, and a laminated map showing the local river system. His nerves fluttered, but he took a steadying breath, reminding himself that he had stared down far greater challenges. Inside, the school's bustling corridors reminded him of simpler days, though he'd never been much of a student. He found the classroom with Timmy's teacher, Mrs. Caldwell, already waiting. Children whispered and craned their necks, clearly excited to meet the man whose tractor had appeared on so many local newscasts. Mrs. Caldwell offered a handshake and guided Henry to the front, where an easel displayed bright posters about different professions. A firefighter had visited earlier that morning, and a nurse was scheduled for the afternoon. Between them stood Henry, a quiet farmer, feeling oddly important, before a dozen wide-eyed kids. The conversation began easily enough. Timmy introduced Henry as the neighbor who saved his life, prompting a small gasp from those who hadn't heard the story. Henry cleared his throat, uncertain how much detail to share. Slowly, he recounted the day of the flood, the swift current, the bus perched on that crumbling embankment, and the old tractor straining to pull it free. The kids listened with rapt attention, many perched on the edges of their seats. Some asked about how he judged the water's depth, or whether he ever felt like giving up. Henry answered simply, stressing how it was a group effort, that Mr. Saunders, the bus driver, was also brave for keeping the children calm. Mrs. Caldwell encouraged them to think about what it meant for everyday people to step up. Then Henry switched gears, showing off the battered tractor piece that had come loose during the rescue and the rescue rope that served as a lifeline. Tiny hands reached out to touch, wide eyes reflecting awe. After the story, questions flowed like water. One boy wanted to know if Henry considered himself a hero. Another girl asked if Bear, his dog, had been scared. Henry shrugged, explaining that Bear was safe on dry ground, while he, on the other hand, had to face a swirl of muddy water. He insisted that hero was a big word for a man who mostly relied on instinct. "I just saw a bus in trouble," he said. "I had a tractor. Seemed like I should help." The children nodded, absorbing the idea that heroism could be simple. Mrs. Caldwell beamed, praising Henry for showing them that real heroes can be neighbors or family members. Timmy looked especially proud, as if he had played a part in the rescue himself simply by being there. Before he left, Henry took out the laminated map, pointing to the winding river that skirted Riverside. He explained that while the water often looked calm, storms far upstream could cause sudden surges. He urged them to trust warnings, to avoid crossing flooded roads, and always to call for help instead of risking a dangerous situation. Mrs. Caldwell asked the class what they had learned, and hands shot up. Students repeated key points: respect nature, listen to alerts, and help each other if trouble came. That last comment stirred something in Henry, a reminder that community unity was a lesson they'd all come to cherish. As the bell rang, the children gathered to thank him. Timmy's grin was biggest of all, brimming with gratitude and admiration. Outside, Henry felt a rush of relief mixed with satisfaction. Standing under the oak tree again, he loaded his visual aids back into the truck. Mrs. Caldwell, walking Timmy to the next class, paused to thank Henry again for sharing his experiences. "It's so important for them to hear stories of real people stepping up," she said, her eyes earnest. Henry smiled, tipping his hat. "I'm glad they found it useful," he replied. With that, he climbed into the driver's seat, heading off to his next errand, a midday meeting with Ms. Rourke to finalize details of the county's new workshop schedule. The contrast between guiding children and negotiating adult responsibilities struck Henry, but both tasks fed into the same goal: ensuring Riverside would never again be caught off guard. At the county building, Henry joined Ms. Rourke, Grant Ellis, and Lieutenant Colton in a small conference room. They had a stack of forms from the volunteer sign-ups, plus a draft budget for new equipment. Ms. Rourke explained that interest had grown so rapidly they needed a formal schedule for training sessions. Grant Ellis flipped through a spreadsheet, pointing out costs for items like extra life vests, portable water pumps, and flares. Henry noticed a section labeled Community Donation Drives. The plan involved local businesses sponsoring some of the gear. "If we can show the state we're serious, we'll have a better shot at matching grants," Ms. Rourke said. Everyone agreed. Henry found himself both impressed and daunted. A casual volunteer network was evolving into something bigger, more official. Lieutenant Colton then announced that the National Guard would donate a surplus inflatable rescue boat and trailer, provided Riverside had enough trained operators. That sparked excitement. Henry smiled at the thought of having proper gear for water rescues. With the possibility of Margaret Sweeney's pilot program, they might also secure funds for advanced training. They hammered out specifics for nearly 2 hours, finalizing a schedule of workshops for the next 3 months. Winter readiness, swift water rescue refresher, and even a workshop on emergency farming techniques. By the time they adjourned, each person carried a stack of papers, representing months of effort. Henry shook hands all around, reminded again of how far they had come since that day the bus nearly vanished in the flood. As Henry drove home, he replayed the day's events: the bright faces at the elementary school, the thorough planning with officials, the sense that Riverside was turning crisis into coordinated strength. He passed the newly dedicated plaque by the main bridge, though the unveiling ceremony was still a week away. It struck him how the memory of a near disaster could galvanize an entire town, bridging differences and forging a collective spirit of preparedness. Thoughts drifted to the children who had listened so intently, to neighbors like Amos who now championed training, and to the deputy director's plans to replicate their efforts in other regions. Despite his fatigue, Henry felt a calm resolve. This was worthwhile work, an extension of that single act of rescue that had altered his path. He pulled into his driveway at dusk, thankful for the warm glow of the porch light, Bear bounding out to greet him, and a quiet evening ahead. In the stillness of that autumn night, he couldn't help but smile at the thought that the seeds of cooperation they'd planted were growing into something strong, with roots that might keep Riverside safe for years to come. Henry awoke the following day with a sense of anticipation. Within a week, the county would unveil the commemorative plaque near the main bridge, honoring the community's resilience since the flood. Despite his natural aversion to fuss, he'd agreed to attend and say a few words. After all, the memory of that day had become a turning point for Riverside. Dawn light revealed frost glazing the fence posts, hinting that winter was pressing closer. Henry shrugged into his heavy coat, whistling for Bear to follow, and headed out to the barn. In the barn's dim interior, his first task was to check on the small herd of goats that provided milk. They seemed healthy enough, though they bleated impatiently when he offered them feed. Next, he looked in on the battered tractor. It had served him faithfully, not just during the rescue, but through years of planting and harvest. He ran his hand along the chipped metal. The memory of hooking a chain to that stranded bus returned in flashes. The swirl of brown water, the children's cries muffled by the roaring current, the moment the tractor nearly toppled. That day felt both distant and oddly present, shaping everything that had come after. Later that morning, Henry hopped in his pickup and drove into town for a short volunteer briefing. The group assembled on a patch of grass behind the fire station, a circle of about 15 locals. Amos Caldwell was there, along with a few other farmers, plus a smattering of teachers, a retired nurse, and a couple of high school seniors who wanted to earn extra credit. Lieutenant Colton arrived shortly after, hauling a duffel bag of first aid supplies. "All right, folks," Colton began, voice steady. "Today we'll run through quick medical assessments and triage. Last time, we covered water rescues. Now we need to make sure we know what to do if we pull someone out of the flood, unconscious or injured." He pulled out bright red bandages, compression wraps, and gloves, laying them on a folding table. Henry watched attentively as one of the volunteer firefighters demonstrated CPR techniques on a practice dummy. A teacher practiced checking for a pulse, while Amos fumbled with the bandages, muttering about how he'd never done anything medical in his life. The retired nurse, Ms. Howard, reassured him that basic knowledge could be the difference between life and death in an emergency. Henry nodded at her words, recalling how fragile those moments had seemed when he'd first seen that bus rocking in the water. Even if a tractor was enough to pull them out, what about injuries that required immediate care? When the training concluded, Lieutenant Colton asked Henry to step forward and share a few thoughts on how improvised aid mattered during the flood. He asked Henry to describe any injuries he encountered. Henry cleared his throat, glancing at Amos and the others. He admitted no one had been seriously hurt that day, aside from bruises and shock. "But that could have turned out different," he added. "We got lucky. If you're volunteering for rescue, you might face worse than we did. Knowing these basic steps might buy someone time until an ambulance arrives." Satisfied expressions lit people's faces. A few folks thanked Henry, saying they felt more confident about stepping up if they ever found themselves in a similar crisis. The group dispersed, leaving Henry and Amos to load the practice equipment into the back of the fire department's truck. Amos huffed, patting the side of a crate. "Never thought I'd be doing this, but it's good work. My wife even wants to join next time. She was so worried during that flood." Henry nodded, cracking a small smile. "The more, the merrier. Let's hope we never have to use all this training, but better safe than sorry." After the briefing, Henry drove to the feed store for some supplies. While there, he noticed flyers advertising the upcoming plaque dedication by the bridge. The flyer mentioned special guest Henry McAllister in large print. He sighed, folding it under his arm. It wasn't that he begrudged the recognition, but each mention of hero and special guest made him squirm. On his way out, the store clerk, Bonnie, caught him. "You're going to the ceremony, right, Henry?" she asked. "Folks are excited to hear you speak." He managed a polite nod, replying that he'd do his best not to disappoint. By midday, Henry was back at the farm. He unloaded feed for the chickens, took inventory of his barn tools, then paused to phone Ms. Rourke about final details for the ceremony. She confirmed the schedule. The county commissioners would gather, the mayor would read a brief statement, and Henry would step up for a short reflection on how the flood had galvanized Riverside. That last part gave him pause. He wasn't sure how to put into words the layers of emotion behind it all. "Just speak from the heart," Ms. Rourke advised gently. "That's what people connect with." In the afternoon, Henry decided to walk the length of the property to unwind. The crisp autumn air carried hints of wood smoke from a neighbor's fireplace. Bear trotted beside him, occasionally darting off to sniff at squirrels. Henry observed the damaged row of corn, feeling a twinge for the lost harvest. If not for the flood, he'd have been preparing to store a decent yield for winter. Still, he reminded himself that no one had died that day. Crops could be replanted. The fortune that mattered was life, and Riverside had come out of the disaster intact. As dusk approached, Henry returned to the farmhouse. He'd promised to host a small gathering of the flood response task force that evening, a chance for them to share updates in a more casual setting. Around 7, vehicles began rolling up the driveway. Ms. Rourke, Grant Ellis, Lieutenant Colton, a teacher from the elementary school, the retired nurse Ms. Howard, and a few others. They filtered onto Henry's porch, where he'd set up a table with coffee, hot cider, and a plate of homemade cookies courtesy of a neighbor who insisted on contributing. Conversation ebbed and flowed. Grant Ellis mentioned that thanks to the continuing volunteer effort, they'd managed to stockpile enough sandbags and tarps for a moderate flooding event. Ms. Howard explained she was collecting first aid kits to distribute at the next workshop. Ms. Rourke, sipping her coffee, joked that Henry should run for local office, given how everyone in town kept referencing him. He chuckled, shaking his head vigorously. "One of me is enough," he said, glancing around. "We need fresh faces, folks who can carry this forward." At one point, the group drifted into deeper reflections on Riverside's transformation. It was the retired nurse who said quietly, "You know, the bus rescue was dramatic, but what followed is the real miracle. People working together like never before." A chorus of agreement followed, with each person recalling some moment when a neighbor stepped up in unexpected ways. Henry listened, a lump forming in his throat. Maybe this was what kept him going day after day, the reminder that even the worst disaster could spark unity and compassion. Eventually, the group disbanded. Henry stood by his porch railing with Lieutenant Colton, who gazed out at the silhouette of the barn. Colton looked pensive. "Henry," he said, "I've been assigned to another region in the coming months, though I'll still check in. But I want you to know, it's been an honor working alongside you. You've taught me as much as I taught you." Henry gave the lieutenant a sturdy handshake, touched by the sentiment. "We couldn't have done this without the guard's guidance," he replied. "Safe travels, Lieutenant. Don't be a stranger." That night, Henry settled into bed, Bear at his feet. Staring at the ceiling, he replayed the day's events. He knew the ceremony by the bridge would be an emotional moment, not just for him, but for everyone who had endured the fear and uncertainty of the flood. In the quiet of his bedroom, he wondered what words he'd speak. Perhaps he'd tell them that no single hero saved the town, but rather a collective spirit of dedication. He dozed off with a mild sense of reassurance, hoping his mind would supply the right phrases when the time came. The week flew by. Henry busied himself with final fall chores, prepping the barn for winter storms and repairing the coop's roofing. Each evening, he jotted notes for his upcoming talk, though none of it felt particularly polished. His style had always been plain speech, nothing more, nothing less. On the eve of the dedication, Ms. Rourke phoned to confirm last-minute details. She teased him about wearing something nice, but Henry retorted that no one should expect him in a suit. She laughed, telling him just to be himself. Morning arrived, bright but chilly. Henry loaded Bear into the truck, wanting the dog's presence for moral support, then set off for town. The unveiling was scheduled for 10, and he spotted a modest crowd already gathered near the bridge. Several reporters with cameras and microphones milled about. The mayor, county commissioners, and local folks filled the small clearing where the plaque was covered by a cloth. Henry parked off to one side, heart thumping harder than he liked. Henry stepped out of his truck and walked Bear on a leash to the small gathering near the bridge. The crisp air carried the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. Townspeople, along with several county commissioners, stood in a semicircle around the veiled plaque. The bus driver, Mr. Saunders, was there, accompanied by a few children who had been on that bus months before. Timmy waved excitedly, and Henry managed a slight grin, though his stomach churned. He wasn't fond of ceremonies, certainly not those centering on him, but he understood this event meant more than personal praise. It was a tribute to the entire community's resolve in the face of disaster. As Henry approached, Mayor Walters caught his eye and gave a friendly nod. The mayor, in a dark overcoat, cleared his throat and tapped a small microphone perched on a portable stand. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice echoing softly over the water. "Thank you for coming to this dedication, which commemorates the spirit that helped Riverside overcome one of its most harrowing floods. We stand here on the very spot where the waters rose highest, where roads were closed, and where we feared for the safety of our friends and neighbors." A hush settled. The breeze ruffled the cloth covering the plaque, drawing attention to the reason for their gathering. Henry stood behind a few taller figures, hoping to remain inconspicuous, but he saw news cameras out of the corner of his eye. His pulse quickened. A sense of gratitude tinged with nerves pulsed through him. He reminded himself that the real story was about how an entire town had banded together, and that he was only one piece of that puzzle. Mayor Walters continued, describing how volunteers sprang up in the aftermath. Folks donated supplies, cooked hot meals, carted sandbags around, and performed rescues. Henry recognized the nod to the fire department, the sheriff's office, and the local farmers who had spontaneously offered equipment. The mayor then praised the new flood response task force for laying permanent foundations so that future floods might be met with calm readiness. "And of course," Walters added, glancing toward Henry, "we all know about the quick thinking of one man who saved a bus full of children, reminding us that heroism can be as close as the next farm over." Applause rippled through the onlookers, and Henry's cheeks warmed. He ducked his head slightly, wishing he could direct that spotlight to all the other volunteers. Bear barked once, perhaps in encouragement or confusion over the clapping. The mayor then gestured for Henry to come forward. A hush fell again as Henry made his way to the microphone, feeling every eye upon him. He removed his cap, holding it in one hand. For a moment he stared at the plaque, the cloth still hiding its inscription. Finally he took a breath. "I'm not one for speeches," Henry said, voice quivering. "But I reckon this plaque isn't about me or any single person. It's about a town that realized we needed each other. When that flood came, it didn't just threaten farmland or property. It threatened our children, our neighbors, our sense of security. What happened afterward was everybody stepping up. Some of us pulled a bus out of the water, sure, but then farmers fixed roads, families fed rescue teams. The county got serious about building a response plan. That's what this plaque means. A reminder that in the face of trouble, we stand together." Timmy grinned. Mr. Saunders wiped the corner of his eye, and the commissioners nodded. Henry swallowed, continuing. "The day I used my tractor to rescue those kids, I didn't feel heroic. I felt scared as anyone else. But I also felt sure that if we do nothing, we lose more than a bus. We lose hope. And now, looking around, I see we've come out stronger. We've got volunteers training every month, building a real safety net. If any of you think you're not needed, think again. Your neighbor might need a hand tomorrow. All of us can help in some way." He paused, exhaling to steady himself. "I'm proud to live in Riverside, proud of how far we've come. Let's keep it going, so we're ready for whatever storms blow in." He glanced at Mayor Walters, who offered a reassuring smile. "That's all I wanted to say," Henry finished awkwardly. A beat of quiet passed. Then the crowd burst into applause. Some folks even cheered, and Henry felt tears prick the corners of his eyes, though he blinked them away. Walters stepped forward, nodding to one of the commissioners who pulled the cloth away. The bronze plaque glinted in the sunlight. Its inscription read, "In honor of the Riverside community, whose unity and courage shone through the flood of year, may this reminder spark hope and resilience for generations to come." Beneath it, smaller lettering acknowledged the volunteers, farmers, first responders, and all who contributed, Henry McAllister among them, but not singled out. Henry let out a faint sigh of relief. He much preferred the plaque highlighting communal effort rather than focusing on his name alone. A small line formed as people took turns studying the plaque. News cameras recorded the event, while local reporters jotted notes. Timmy bounded over, hugging Henry around the waist. "Your speech was awesome," the boy declared. Henry ruffled Timmy's hair, grinning. The bus driver, Mr. Saunders, shook Henry's hand for the 100th time, expressing how each day he drove that route, he felt a fresh wave of gratitude. Amos Caldwell ambled up, giving Henry a playful punch on the shoulder. "Not half bad for a quiet fella," Amos teased. Bear, sensing Henry's relief, wagged his tail, lapping up all the attention. Henry bent down to unclip the leash so the dog could greet friendly onlookers. Then Ms. Rourke and Grant Ellis emerged from the crowd, both praising Henry's talk. "I like that you kept it about everyone," Ms. Rourke said. "That's exactly what Riverside stands for now." Henry just nodded, a lump in his throat. A few more short speeches followed, one from a commissioner, another from the fire department chief. Before long, the gathering started to break apart, people huddling in smaller clusters to chat. Henry stepped aside with Ms. Rourke and Grant Ellis, who revealed that Margaret Sweeney had phoned earlier, promising new state support for local rescue gear. "She wants Riverside to pilot a farmland watch program," Ellis explained. "So if a future flood or any major emergency happens, we can mobilize everyone quickly." Henry smiled. "That's good news. Another piece of the puzzle." A local reporter approached, politely requesting a brief interview. Henry agreed, though he kept his words simple, once again emphasizing how the entire community contributed. The reporter asked if Henry now felt like Riverside's official spokesperson on safety. He half laughed, replying, "I'm just a farmer who saw a need. But we'll keep building on that. It's not about me. It's about all of us." Eventually, the crowd thinned, and Henry noticed Timmy's mom beckoning them over to a little table stacked with pastries and hot chocolate cups. The improvised refreshment station offered some warmth on the chilly morning. Henry poured a cup of hot chocolate for Timmy, who sipped happily, chocolate mustache forming. Meanwhile, Bear trotted around, hoping for crumbs. A gentle camaraderie enveloped them all, the hush of water flowing beneath the rebuilt bridge. When Henry finished, he quietly slipped away to the water's edge. He gazed at the gentle current that had once turned wild, swirling with unstoppable force. For a moment he closed his eyes, recalling the panic of seeing that bus about to tip, the chain tight between tractor and metal, and the thunderous roar in his ears. A shiver ran through him. He exhaled slowly, letting the memory roll away. He'd never forget it, but he no longer felt the same dread. Riverside had found a way to transform that terror into unity. Bear nudged Henry's leg, and he ran a hand over the dog's head. Off in the distance, people laughed and talked around the new plaque. It was a moment of closure, yet it also felt like a beginning. They wouldn't become complacent. The newly formed volunteer network, the upgraded alerts, and the ongoing workshops proved the town had set a path toward self-reliance and readiness. If the next flood ever came, they'd meet it together. Henry took one last look at the plaque, shining in the sunlight. He appreciated its sturdy presence, a symbol of a town determined not to let a disaster define it. Then, with a soft call to Bear, he turned from the water and walked back toward his truck. On the way, he paused to shake hands with a few neighbors, accepting quiet words of thanks. Ms. Rourke waved, and Henry tipped his hat, letting her know he'd see them at the next task force gathering. Timmy ran up, pressing a slip of paper into Henry's palm, another drawing of the tractor, a keepsake. Henry smiled, heart full. At the driver's seat, he patted Bear one more time, then started the engine. He felt the unwavering truth of that day's significance. Months ago, an ordinary morning had turned harrowing, leading him onto a winding road of responsibilities and change. Now Riverside was safer, more united, and Henry had discovered a calling he never anticipated. The flood was behind them, but the determination it sparked still flowed. He navigated across the newly repaired bridge, glancing in the rear-view mirror at the plaque's reflection. In the distance, the crowd dispersed, each person returning to daily life. Henry whispered a grateful prayer under his breath, then pressed the accelerator. His farmland awaited, chores piling up with each passing hour. But he left comforted by the knowledge that if another crisis ever struck, no one in Riverside would stand alone. They'd face it side by side, guided by what they'd learned, and by the bond they'd forged when the river threatened to sweep everything away.